Welcome to Commander Central, episode 313, and today we'll be taking a look at patron supporter Ormondal's Xyris, the Writhing Storm deck. I'm Dana.
And I'm Max.
Max, how's it going today?
It is a great day, Dana. It's Friday. We're recording a day later than normal. I got like 10 hours of sleep last night, which is great.
It's kind of sunny out. It's
kind of sunny out. It's the first time I've recorded since, I don't know, December or January where I don't have the space heater on behind me in the basement, in the dungeon, so that's nice as well. And we're getting together tonight to play Paper Magic in person.
We are. I'm looking forward to that. And it's April Fool's Day. I considered doing an April Fool's Day show, but Chris isn't here, and it would have been more fun to do it with Chris. So we're not going to do that this year, although I have had lots of people give us feedback about when we did a few years back where we never actually talked about anything. We just kept postponing the topic.
Everything else
for an
magic.
hour. Yeah. That turned out pretty good, but it'll be a tough one to top anyway. So
for sure.
So yeah, this will air the first couple of days of April here, but we don't have Chris again this week. So again, we're hoping for next week. We'll see where he's at.
Yeah,
and yeah, we'll play some games this week and hopefully have some good stories from those as well for next week's show.
For sure.
We started getting a few new Capenna things. Nothing really shocking has came through. We're not going to go into great detail about the few cards that have been released. It's a 3-color set, so no surprise there at all. It's shard colors, which everyone had kind of guessed as well. So really no surprise there. Lots of demon stuff, no surprise there. So it's starting, and I think by next week, Monday, spoilers will be in full effect. So we're back into it, baby.
Woo.
That's okay. You know what? I really enjoyed Neon Dynasty, and I'm not feeling burnt out or anything right now, so I'm ready for another spoiler season to kick off.
Yeah. I'm looking forward to it. I agree. This set has me a little more intrigued than Neon Dynasty did, so I'm looking forward to it.
All right. Well, if you out there in the listener land want to reach out to us and to talk about any fun things happening in the world of magic around you, how'd you go about doing that, Max?
You can find us on Twitter at CMDR Central. You can find us on Facebook by searching CMDR Central. And you can hear us every week on YouTube by searching CMDR Central.
You can also find us on patreon.com/CMDR Central.
Yeah, head over there and check out our reward tiers such as joining our community or guesting on the show.
And I think we have a couple new Patreons this week to shout out.
Yeah, we want to say hello and welcome and thank you to Mike Flucher, Christopher Culver, and Matt Flucher.
Thank you all for supporting the show, and thanks to everyone for supporting us, whether you support us through Patreon or just by listening and clicking those likes and upvote buttons. It means a lot, and we appreciate it.
Yeah. One final note, since we are still missing Chris, he's still recuperating, he's doing the best he can. So what I think would be cool is if everybody out there who is on Twitter just send him a get well message at @YSquishy1 and maybe throw in your favorite Rakdos card and tell him why it's your favorite.
That is a great idea. Good call, Max. All right, should we jump into taking a look at this deck?
Let's do it.
So Ormondal sent us a copy of his Xyris, the Writhing Storm deck, and there's a few notes on his meta here. Max, you want to read them to us?
Yeah, he says, he leads the meta. Whenever I adjust my deck, everyone else does as well, so they can kick my butt. Please don't give my meta too hard of a time since I finance most of their decks.
Sure.
So he said in his Xyris Writhing Storm deck, he says it's a group hug deck with no wheels, which is pretty interesting since most Xyris decks come with the wheel package involved. And his playgroup has a on-color fetches only rule, which I appreciate.
Sure.
The goal of the deck is to strangle them with value in the name of the game, and the win con is pretty much Goblin Bombardment and Vicious Shadows, or an Altar of Dementia works as well. The weakness, he said, I'm not sure the weaknesses because the deck hasn't lost yet. Ooh, that's pretty impressive.
Okay.
So he's interested in what we will have to say, and then the budget would be no more than $100 on a card.
Okay, so we're not going to power this up then. We just want to talk about maybe some things that would smooth it out. The goal isn't to make it necessarily stronger because it's not losing games. So we're not going to delve too deeply into this would make it even better because it's actually a pretty solid deck. For those that don't recall, Xyris is 5 mana, 2 green, blue, red for a Snake Leviathan. It's a 3/5 with flying by default. Whenever an opponent draws a card, except for the first one they draw on each of their turns, you create a 1/1 green snake creature token. And whenever Xyris the Writhing Storm deals combat damage to a player, you and that player each draw that many cards. We have a commander that cares about people drawing stuff, your opponents, and it makes you tokens when they do so. Almost always winds up being a wheel commander, and this is not a wheel commander. So, or at least the deck isn't brewed that way. So that's definitely an interesting thing to see because that's usually how Xyris decks almost universally wind up being brewed. You want to start us off with the land base here, Max? We can start there and take a look at what's in the list.
For sure. There are 36 lands. There's an Arcane Lighthouse, a Blighted Woodland, Breeding Pool, Command Tower, Copperline Gorge, Detection Tower, Dreamroot Cascade, Dust Bowl, Fabled Passage, Forbidden Orchard, 4 forests, 1 Forge of Heroes, a Gemstone Caverns, Hinterland Harbor, 4 islands, Mikokuru, Center of the Sea. I practiced that one beforehand.
Nice.
Mountain, Prismatic Vista, Reflecting Pool, Rejuvenating Springs, Rootbound Crag, Spire Garden, Spire Bluff Canal, Steam Vent Stomping Ground, Stone Carved Coast, Training Center, and Yavimaya Cradle of Growth.
Okay, so that's a pretty solid land base.
That's a perfect land base.
Yeah, I mean, that's basically what you would be running for the most part. Anything that stands out at you that you don't like in it, Max?
Yeah, the one that kind of caught my eye was the Gemstone Caverns. This was recently reprinted in Time Spiral Remastered.
Yep.
It's a legendary land, and it says, if Gemstone Caverns is in your opening hand, and you're not the starting player, you may begin the game with it in play on the battlefield with a luck counter on it. If you do, you have to exile a card from your hand. And then you can tap and add colorless, but if it has the luck counter on it, it can tap for any color.
So this is traditionally a deck you see in kind of CEDH style decks, a card you see in CEDH style decks where people want speed at all costs. So you're hoping you have it in your opening hand so you can start off ahead. I would say I also think it doesn't fit the power level of this particular build. It's one I would pull, not because it's not great, it is great, but it's if you're trying to keep this deck at the same basic level that your playgroup is, and it's already winning a bunch of games, ratcheting back the speed is probably a good idea. I would replace that with something else, for sure.
Easiest replacements would be something like Mana Confluence or City of Brass, just because, they ping you for a damage, but they make any color, and the nice thing, Mana Confluence would be preferred, because if Yavimaya is out, you can always tap it for green without getting hurt.
If you want to stay cheap, Exotic Orchard is probably going to make you, 2 of your 3 colors that you need most of the time anyway, let alone there's plenty of times it's going to make you all 3, and it's significantly cheaper than either of those and doesn't damage you. There's also many times it's going to make you 1 color, so it's got some downside too, but it's also just much cheaper. So if you want to go the bargain route, that's a pretty good swap in there as well.
What about you, Dana?
So there's 2. I mean, I don't dislike anything, although I'm not sure that Forge of Heroes is necessarily that amazing in this particular deck. But there's 2 that I would consider finding a slot for. The better of the 2 would be Gyre Reach Sanitarium. It is just a land that taps for colorless mana, but you can spend 2 and each player draws a card and then discards a card. So it's just a way to proc more snakes when you make your opponents all draw cards then. And the other one is Cephaloid Coliseum. It's one of the threshold lands, I think, from way back in Odyssey. Doesn't come into play tapped, but when it taps for mana, in this case blue mana, it does a damage to you, so it's a pain land. But it has a threshold ability, and you can spend blue and sacrifice it, and target player draws 3 cards and discards 3 cards. You have to have 7 cards in your graveyard to activate that, but that's not an impossible thing to hit plenty of times, particularly in a deck like this. It's just another way to, again, in the right situation, you can just force someone to draw some cards, or yourself. It's not, I guess, limited to somebody else, but if you need the cards, you can draw them, but you can also use it as a way to force people to make you snakes, basically.
Yeah.
So I mean, I don't think your deck's functioning just fine with them, but I think those are some interesting things you don't see that often, and I think they play pretty well with this particular deck.
I have one more note I want to throw in on the land base.
All right.
Blighted Woodland. So this is from one of the newer Battle for Zendikar sets. You can pay 3 and a green and sacrifice it and search your library for 2 basic lands and put them on the field tapped. You run 11 basics in this deck. Between Blighted Woodland and the Sorceries we'll talk about in a little bit, all of those land fetch lands essentially get you all your basics. You have enough cards in this deck that could possibly grab you exactly 11 basics out of your deck. There are going to be times where you might only start a hand with basics. Maybe you're going to mulligan that away, but that's something I would also look at is maybe just cut Blighted Woodland for a basic.
Yeah, I don't think it's particularly great in general, but especially in a deck that isn't on a budget or something, I definitely don't think it's necessary. It's just so slow and clunky.
Right.
So, yeah, that's one I don't necessarily love, so I'm with you there. Okay, should we jump over to the sorceries here?
Okay.
Let's jump over to the sorceries here. There's 7 of them in this deck. Mostly ramp spells. There's an explosive vegetation. There's a Kadama's Reach. There's a rampant growth. There's a migration path. And there's also things like Jessica's Will, which is just a busted card and already up to $20 now. Vandal Blast, again, just a great piece of removal. And last but not least, Sky Scribing, which is X blue, and each player draws X cards. And it has a forecast ability as well. But it's just a way to, it's not a wheel, but it like lets everyone draw so you can take advantage of the ability to make a bunch more snakes. I didn't necessarily really have anything here. So if you want to focus on more like killing people with creatures, this is obviously where you could run an Overrun or an Overwhelming Stampede or even a Mercadi's Downfall kind of spell to be able to buff all those creatures when you swing in. But like other than that, this is kind of exactly what I would expect to see in this kind of deck.
Yeah, I definitely agree. Putting an Overrun type effect is probably a good idea, whether it's Overrun, Overwhelming Stampede, or even like Triumph of the Hordes.
Yeah.
Giving all your 1/1 snakes +1/+0 and Infect and Trample will probably still get some damage through. My suggestion in regards to like the ramp spells would be Tempt with Discovery. I know we talk about it a lot, that you should never take the tempting offer to go get a land out of your deck, but this is a group hug deck. Like, if you want your opponents to do stuff, you're going to probably get someone to say yes every now and then. And Tempt with Discovery gets any land versus just basics. And this again comes back to the fact that you run 11 basics and you have all the cards in here, will get 9 of them out of your deck. I was wrong earlier. I redid the math. So, I mean, if you really need to go get, that Yavimaya or, your Dust Bowl for whatever reason, you could run a Tempt with Discovery and just go grab your Dust Bowl.
Yeah, and I guess I might as well note it here. There's explosive vegetation in this deck in the migration path. Skyshroud Claim is just better. And yeah, it's, almost $3 now, I guess, for even the most recent Battle Bond reprint versus vegetation and the migration path are, I guess they're not nothing. They're both $1 cards too. But Skyshroud Claim lets you go with the lands into play untapped. And because it lets you get forests, you can grab like the breeding pool or something. Similarly, there's rampant growth in here. And, 3 visits is only a couple bucks after the most recent reprint as well. And Nature's Lores, a couple bucks also. They're just both better versions that, again, they can go grab the dual lands and they come into play untapped if you have that, if you want to do it that way. This deck isn't one that's like needing those little edges probably to win, since it, like you said, it's been undefeated so far, but it's worth noting those cards are just slightly better versions of the ones you're running and will make life a little bit easier.
Yeah, totally agree.
How about the instants here, Max? What are the instants in the deck?
The instants, in short term, are just a bunch of counter spells, but I'll go through them all.
Sure.
Aetherize, Arcane Denial, Blue Sun Zenith, Cyclonic Rift, Deprive, Destructive Revelry, Evacuation, Fierce Guardianship, Negate, Swansong, and Tybalt's Trickery. So there are some draw spells in here. There are some, blow stuff up spells in here, and some defensive spells, but it is mainly just counter magic.
Yep.
Which I would expect to see.
Anything jump out at you as that you like or dislike or that is odd to you?
Deprive is odd to me. So this is for blue. It's an instant from Rise of the Eldrazi. As an additional cost to cast Deprive, return a land you control to its owner's hand, and then you counter target spell. You have 1 card in here, I think, maybe 2, that care about landfall, essentially, like a landfall ability.
Yeah.
So I don't see this being marginally better than Counterspell. Just run Counterspell. Then you don't have to bounce a land. Especially, what if you are in a jam and you need to counter something and it's turn 3? Do you really want to take that temple hit and bounce a land to your hand?
I don't think you do, unless you have a lot of extra reason to do so. It's just not worth it. Even if you already had Counterspell in here, I'd still be like, I'd just run Negate, or I'd just run, I'd find something else. Unless you have a lot of ways to really take advantage of bouncing that land, so I just don't like Deprive at all.
Yeah, so that would be my only suggestion is swap Deprive for Counterspell, or Negate, or there's already a Negate, but you get what we're saying.
Yep.
Destructive Revelry, I don't see this played a lot, but it does destroy an artifact or enchantment and deal some damage, so it's cool for red and a green versus something like a Deglammer or an Unravel the Aether, which I would typically prefer because it's that single pip versus needing 2 colors.
Right. I would agree. I don't. The shock damage is negligible in relevance to the game versus, a Declammer or a Revel of the Aether that can also hit indestructible and also don't generate triggers and also make things tougher to recur and are easier to cast. Nothing wrong with Destructive Revelry. It's a perfectly fine card, but I would much rather get added gas out of the Declammer or out of the Aether than just get a 2 damage to one person. A Fierce Guardianship, again, is kind of odd in that it's a great card and it feels maybe stronger than the deck needs, but it's maybe needed because people go for Xyris every single time, so you need to have as many ways to protect it as possible. So it's a ridiculously strong card. I was just noting that it seems like it's a little bit out of place given the power level of the deck, but I run it in a couple of semi-casual-ish decks as well, so I get it. Sometimes you just can't afford to be spending 14 mana on your commander. It starts off kind of expensive and gets worse from there, so you want to just minimize removal. So that makes sense to me, I guess. But yeah, there's nothing else really I had, for instance, that jumped out at me either. I think Blue Sun Zenith is kind of a pain in the butt to try to cast the triple blue pips. And, how often are you going to want to be dumping a ton of mana into it to help somebody else draw just to make a bunch of snakes? I think there's maybe better ways to do that we'll probably get into in some other categories. So I don't love Blue Sun Zenith, but it's not bad or anything. It's fine.
Yeah, because Stroke of Genius is 2x
2 and a blue, yeah.
Yeah.
So it's a little bit easier. The other one I'm confused about is not confused about, but that I don't necessarily love is Evacuation. Not that it's not a perfectly good card necessarily, but I think most of the time I would rather just wipe the board versus bouncing a bunch of stuff. I'd rather just run a, Chandra's Ignition or something that takes a Blasphemous Act in this case, because it's almost always going to cost 1 red because you are making a bunch of creatures. I could just rather have a board wipe than I would a mass bounce, I think. Another thing I would consider in that Evacuation slot that costs the exact same amount of mana is Perplexing Test. It's an instant. You can choose one of 2 possible modes: return all non-token creatures to their owner's hands, or return all creature tokens to their owner's hands. Since your deck is probably going to be making a lot more tokens than most people, it gives you an option to do a mass wipe that doesn't bounce all your snakes back. I think that would be it's a stronger card. Again, if you don't want to make the deck stronger, I guess I get that. But I feel like more often than not, it's going to let you win games. You're going to be the situations where you've got a dozen snake tokens out and someone else's board is clogged up. And you can just bounce the stuff that isn't yours for the most part, like named creatures, and all your tokens will stick around. Then you just smash through for the Alpha Strike when they have no blockers left. So again, we're not necessarily looking to power up the deck, but I do think Perplexing Test is probably a more useful card in this deck, by and large, than Evacuation would be.
Yeah, that's a great suggestion.
Okay, Max, let's take a look next at the enchantments.
Okay, there are 19 of them. Awakening, this is 2 and 2 green, and it says at the beginning of each player's upkeep, untap all creatures and lands. There's Bard class, red and a green. Legendary creatures enter the battlefield with an additional +1/+1 counter. Level 2 says legendary spells you cast cost red-green less to cast. It only reduces the colored mana. And then level 3 for 3 in Gruul says whenever you cast a legendary spell, exile the top 2 cards of your library and you may play them this turn. There's a Beastmaster Ascension, which is just a big buff for all the tokens. Dictate a Karametra is 3 and 2 green. It has flash, and whenever a player taps a land for mana, that player adds 1 mana to his or her mana pool of any type that land produced. We also have the Dictate a Crufix in this deck, which is 1 and 2 blue with flash, and at the beginning of each player's draw step, that player draws an additional card. Druid class for 1 and a green. Whenever a land enters the battlefield under your control, you gain 1 life. You can level it up for 2 and a green, and then you can play an additional land on each of your turns. You can make it level 3 by paying 4 and a green. Whenever this class becomes level 3, target land you control becomes a creature with haste, and this creature's power and toughness are equal to the number of lands you control, and it is still a land. We have Eladrami's Vineyard. It is a single green, and it says at the beginning of each player's main phase, add double green to that player's mana pool. A favorite card of mine is Fevered Visions, 1 red and a blue. At the beginning of each player's end step, that player draws a card. If that player is your opponent and has 4 or more cards in hand, Fevered Visions deals 2 damage to that player. There's a Forced Fruition in this deck, 4 and 2 blue. Whenever an opponent plays a spell, that player draws 7 cards. As mentioned in the notes, Goblin Bombardment, 1 in a red, sacrifice a creature. Goblin Bombardment does 1 damage to any target. Heartbeat of Spring, this is 2 in a green. Whenever a player taps a land for mana, it that player adds 1 mana of any type that land produced. There's an Impact Tremors, 1 in a red. When a creature enters the battlefield under your control, Impact Tremors deals 1 damage to each opponent. Mana Echoes, 2 and 2 red. Whenever a creature enters the battlefield, you may add an amount of colorless mana equal to the number of creatures you control that share a type with it. Well, here's where all those X spells come in, Dana.
Yes.
Overabundance, 1 red and a green. Whenever a player taps a land for mana, that player adds 1 additional mana to his or her mana pool of the same type. Then Overabundance deals 1 damage to that player. Primal Vigor, 4 and a green. If 1 or more tokens would be put onto the battlefield, twice that many tokens are put onto the battlefield instead. And if 1 or more +1/+1 counters would be placed on a creature, twice that many are placed on a creature instead. Little note, this affects everybody, not just the player who owns the card. Rites of Flourishing, 2 and a green. At the beginning of each player's draw step, they draw an additional card, and each player may play an additional land each turn. Shared Animosity, 2 and a red. Whenever a creature you control attacks, it gets +1/+0 until end of turn for each other attacking creature that shares a type with it. And then we have Vicious Shadows, 6 and a red. Whenever a creature is put into a graveyard from play, you may have Vicious Shadows deal damage to target player equal to the number of cards in that player's hand. And then finally, rounding out the enchantments is Well of Ideas. 5 and a blue. When it enters the battlefield, you draw 2 cards. At the beginning of each other player's draw step, that player draws an additional card. Then at the beginning of your draw step, you draw 2 additional cards.
A lot of interesting stuff there, a lot of token interaction and ways to kind of take advantage of, or at least make everyone draw more cards so you can take advantage of that on your end. One card I don't necessarily love here, I think it's a neat card, Eldrazi's Vineyard. And I guess I know the plan is so each player has more mana to do things on their turn and hopefully cast more spells that draw them cards maybe so you can take advantage of that. I just don't know if that's that useful here necessarily. I'm sure it's not a bad card, but I also feel like it's not particularly good here compared to something that synergizes better with a deck. What do you think, Max?
Yeah, this one caught me off guard. I feel like this is better set in the Shaman commander that pretty much brought back Mana Burn. I think that's where this card kind of should belong. And the fact that, he's probably using these extra green mana for the X spells, or the colorless spells in this deck. There's not a lot of big X green spells in this deck, so I don't know what you would want that double green mana for outside of, cool, I'm going to cast a Brainstorm for a million, or a Blue Sun Zenith, not Brainstorm. Wow.
Yeah, Brainstorm for a million seems unlikely.
Well, you can do whatever you want with your mana.
Yeah, I also am a little bit torn about Awakening. I know I don't necessarily love helping other opponents of mine, but it's not that. I just don't know of how much advantage you necessarily gain from it. Again, I think this is giving your opponents mana so they can do more things and hopefully draw you more cards, or hopefully draw more cards and make you more snakes or whatever. I think it's just as likely to backfire, and that's would be frustrating as well to play this thing and then have somebody be able to use the extra mana or the ability to untap stuff so they can counterspell your stuff. I think the chances of it being frustrating are significantly more than they are it being useful to you.
Yeah, so I'm kind of torn on this. I get it. It's probably a little harder to remove than something like a Seedborn Muse.
Sure.
But this does help everybody. My only idea is that since he mentioned that he kind of is the deck provider for the meta.
Yep.
Maybe he knows what's in all the other decks, so it might not be a problem.
Sure. Yeah, could be. Could well be. A couple of cards that I did kind of like here that aren't in the deck that I think might be useful. Psychic Possession, which you skip your draw step, but you draw whenever the person that's enchanted with it draws. Since you're making everyone else draw, it always breaks even, basically. You just push your draw back and you draw on someone else's turn is the worst case scenario. And there's going to be a lot of times in this deck where you just draw a gazillion cards off it because you have so many things that are making everyone else draw anyway, that it's just going to be really, really good in general, generically. So that's one I like a lot, although it's up to I think $5-ish now. Also Teferi's Ageless Insight, just because again, there's so many spells that make everyone draw cards, which lets you draw twice as many cards. So that's one I like as well, that I feel like those probably would perform more consistently for you than the Awakening, say, would, or the Bard class might. Because Bard class is one that you didn't love, or is that true, Max?
Yeah, I'm not a fan of really either of the classes in this deck. I just feel like they are mana sinks, I guess. Yeah. I mean, I get playing an extra land is nice with the mono druid class.
Yep.
But you're only running 36 lands. This isn't a
Right.
landfall deck. You're just trying to get ahead at that point.
Right.
And it's not like there's not a what's the artifact that brings things like lands back from the graveyard? Crucible Worlds.
Crucible
There
Worlds,
we go.
yeah.
There's not one of those in this deck, so it's not even like you're getting the extra value by just having that casually in this deck. You know what I mean?
Right.
I think that's kind of an issue. There is a lot of things that deal with playing extra lands, and I get you want to help your opponent, so I get why like Rite of Flourishing is in here.
Yeah.
Because that helps everybody. But, Druid Quest only helps you. And you aren't benefiting except for the fact that you're playing one extra land. And yes, I know that is a benefit. That is, I get it. But when this deck is already claimed to be undefeated, maybe that's an edge you can take away.
Yes, I would agree with that as well. That's good. And you had one more note here, Max, that I think is going to kind of fold into some comments I'm going to make moving forward. And that's Doubling Season and Parallel Lives in particular you're asking about, since there's already a Primal Vigor here.
Yeah, so I understand Primal Vigor because it doubles your opponent's snakes as well. I get it. At the same time, that means more bodies for them to attack you with.
Right.
Because these don't have vigilance. It's not like you can block with them after you attack. So I wonder why you just aren't running Doubling Season or Parallel Lives instead, because you would still get the benefit of getting all the extra snakes.
Yeah, I agree with that. And I also think that, and I'll be talking about this kind of strategy moving forward when we talk about artifacts and creatures here. But I agree with that because I do think what would probably help this deck a bit is to lean stronger into it kind of being a token deck. There's nothing fairer for the most part than like winning with combat damage. And if this deck is winning a lot and you're trying to keep it in check and not like arms race off your meta, which is kind of the vibe I got from his descriptions, that's a good way to put the brakes on what you can do with the deck to a degree, is if you're like, I'm just going to focus here primarily on winning via killing people with my token swarm.
Right.
And ways to enable that are things like Doubling Season and Parallel Lives that just make it easier to get that wide token swarm out here. And there's a few things I will mention under the artifacts, too, that will enable that. Do you have anything else to say about enchantments, so Max, before I move on?
I get why a lot of these are, like Mana Echoes. I get why that card is in here. I don't think there's enough payoff in the deck to use the mana you are probably going to be making every main phase by making your opponents draw cards.
So here's what I would say about the Mana Echoes, and I can see how right now in the deck it's maybe not as efficient as it could be, and to a degree Shared Animosity is the same way, because it really is only going to be working with the snakes that you're making off the Xyris. So one thing a point I'm going to make when we get over to creatures, and I guess I can make it right now, I think you should just make it into a snake tribal deck. And here's why. That there's a cap. There's not a lot of good snakes, and the couple of good ones that are out there are already in the deck. Things like Lotus Copra or Shizuku, Caller of Autumn. It's a pretty lean tribe in terms of finding quality bodies. And I think if you want to keep this deck in check and like not worry about blasting past everybody with any changes, that's just a good hard cap. Hard cap yourself to running snakes. And that you're going to get a little bit of added synergies to offset that. Your Mana Echoes is going to work on everything that comes into play. Your Shared Animosity is going to work on everything that comes into play. It synergizes well with the kind of token strategy I talked about and having that be kind of your main focus for your win condition as well. But it also gives you a hard cap. There's just like the amount of really good snakes is pretty limited, and it's going to force you to maybe work a little bit harder to make the deck as powerful as it kind of just accidentally is when you're not limiting yourself.
Yeah, I kind of agree with that. You can keep all the support cards that help everybody draw and untap, and is great. And I never thought about swapping that to a Snake Tribal deck, and I'm sure we'll dig a little deeper here in a minute.
Yeah, you're going to lose some good stuff among your creatures, things that are good on their own, and you're going to have to replace them with some inferior things. But in the right situation, the added synergy from things like the Shared Animosity are going to make those creatures, are going to buff them up enough that they'll perform, but it just is going to require a little more work versus, the ancient Green Wardens of the world just accidentally being amazing. So artifacts, though, first. The artifacts deck, there's 11 of them. An Ultra of Dementia, which is the way that you sacrifice a thing and target player puts a number of cards equal to the sacrificed creature's power from the top of their library into their graveyard. Ideally, this is when you have something like a Shared Animosity out, so like those little snakes of yours are, 8/8s, and you can just sacrifice them all and maybe even mill somebody out.
Yeah.
Ultra the Brood, whenever another permanent enters the battlefield under your control, each opponent puts a top card of their library into their graveyard, so you're going to mill people based on those snakes coming into play. Arcane Signet for ramp. There's also a Soul Ring in here for ramp and a Thematic Compass. There's a Bowl of Nylea Attacking creatures you control have Death Touch, and you can choose one of the following modes for an activated ability. You can put a +1 counter on a target creature, or you can have the bow deal 2 damage to a creature with flying, or you can gain 3 life, or you can put up to 4 target cards from your graveyard in the bottom of your library in any order. There's an Eldrazian Monument. It gives creatures you control +1/+1 and flying indestructible. Beginning of your upkeep, you have to sacrifice a creature to maintain it, but in this deck, you probably will always have creatures. Folio Fancies is an artifact that lets you make everyone draw. Girper Ori lets each player play an additional land on each of their turns, and each player's upkeep, if that player has no cards in hand, that player draws 3 cards. Howling Mind, just everyone draws an additional card during their draw step. Strixhaven Stadium is kind of a win condition if you're going to go wide here with these tokens. And last is as a Thematic Compass, which is one of the flip artifacts from way back in Ixalan. And this one lets you search your library for a basic land card, reveal it and put it into your hand, then shuffle your library. And if you control 7 or more lands, you flip that. And the flip side is Spires of Erazka. And basically, it's a Maze of Ith on the other side.
How was that 5 years ago? Ixalan was 5 years ago.
Yeah, no kidding. How crazy is that?
I was sitting here chuckling, like, no, it was like 2 years ago. Nope, 2017. Okay.
Yeah, that's Ikoria was 2 years ago.
Dang pandemic screwed up my timeline.
It is insane. So I like all of these. I'm not too sold on either of the 2 altars. I get the purpose of them. The things I'm not sold on them are if you're playing with a more casual group, people don't love seeing their cards milled away. There's a lot of things that have to happen for them to be win conditions anyway. And, if someone's playing a graveyard deck, you're just really feeding them basically. And it's not like you're feeding them, but you're going to win. You're feeding them. And like I said, you need a bunch of things to happen for those cards to put you in a position to win. So I don't necessarily love either of those 2. Bowl of Nylea is fine. I don't think it's that powerful or effective. Again, it's fine. So those are the ones that I don't love. Are there any things from you, Max, that you want to note here?
So I'll start with, I want to comment on the altars here.
Sure.
I agree with you in the fact that if you're playing in a casual area, players don't like seeing their stuff get milled away. I do like them in this deck, but I don't think you need both. I think if you are playing on the more casual end of the spectrum, play Altar of the Brood, because it's symmetrical in the sense that every opponent is getting milled versus you single targeting someone for a bunch at one time, where this is cool, you made 5 snakes, but everybody's milling 5 cards versus your example of, hey, I have 10, 8, 1 snakes, I'm going to sack them all and just mill out player number 2 because that's 80 cards. That's going to go away from their library, and this is turn 4. They're probably 20 cards deep by now. I think Altar of the Brood of the 2 is more casual, to be honest. Especially because there's not a lot of combo potential where, in my Brago deck, it's a combo piece. I don't like Thematic Compass in this deck. And it goes back to what I said earlier. You have 11 basics, and if this comes down on, turn 8, you could be out of basics.
Right, yeah.
Granted, it'll flip because you have 7 or more lands, and I think that's really what this is I bet 85% of the time this comes down and flips immediately with all the extra land playing cards in this deck. So I would probably cut that for something, another land almost, because I do think 36 is a little low for 3 colors, even though you're in green. Cut it for another land, or cut it for another creature, or another X spell where you can use that Mana Echoes mana, or an overrun. I don't like it, just because of how the land base is built.
Yeah, I tend to agree. I like Thematic Compass in a general sense, but there are a couple of things that you said that kind of ring true around the basic lands. And particularly in a deck like this where you are just making so many tokens, the defensive portion on the other side isn't that important either. There are decks where it is, but I don't think this is one. You're just probably always going to have snakes available to block. So I don't love the first side. I don't think the second side is that necessary in this particular deck.
Yeah. I that's my opinion. I mean, at this point, put in Obscuring Haze, the green free spell. There's a fog. No one's going to see that coming.
Yeah. 2 cards, I guess, that I would suggest that tie a little bit more into my suggestion that you focus more on tokens and or snakes is Heraldic Banner. Again, it's just it's a mana rock, so it's always going to be useful. And you just set it to the color that you have most frequently in your deck, probably green because you're making green snake tokens, and it's just going to buff those up while being a mana rock. It's just really, really useful, and I would suggest that here. And I think if you do go the snake route, a lot of your snakes are going to be green too, so it will just work out really well there. So I think that one will be good. And there's also a Throne of the God Pharaoh where you deal damage based on tapped creatures. And again, if you're going to go that route with a little bit more of a tokeny /snake deck, you're going to have those turns where you go kill somebody because you swing with, 11 or 12 snakes or something, and you can just pass a turn, and because of Throne of the God Pharaoh, you can do that much damage to somebody else. So that's one I would consider too, and in a token deck that can do a lot of work as well.
Yeah, I have a suggestion based on the timeline of where this gets flipped into a snake tribal deck. Vanquisher's Banner is 5 mana, you choose a creature type, creatures of that type get +1/+1, and then whenever you cast a spell of that type, draw a card. If you're running all snakes, you're going to draw some cards off that, and it pumps all your tokens.
Yeah, that would be really solid, this deck, I think, for sure. All right, Max, you want to read the creatures here to us, last but not least?
Last but not least, there are 15 creatures. Ancient Green Warden, this is 4 and 2 green. It has reach. You can play lands from your graveyard. See, here's the Crucible Worlds. I knew it was in here. Yep, there it is. If a land entering the battlefield causes a triggered ability to trigger it again. We have Essex, Fractal Bloom, 4 green, blue, legendary creature. It has flying, and then the first time you would create 1 or more tokens during each of your turns, you may instead choose a creature other than Essex Fractal and create that many tokens that are copies of that creature. So I'm guessing as you cast a creature, make it a snake token, and make that many tokens?
I think so, yeah. That's my understanding, kind of.
This card gets really confusing to me. We have Glade Muse. Whenever a player casts a spell, if it's not their turn, they draw a card. Heartwood Storyteller is 1 green for a 2/3 treefolk. Whenever a player casts a non-creature spell, each of that player's opponents may draw a card. Kami of the Crescent Moon, blue. At the beginning of each player's draw step, that player draws an additional card. The aforementioned Lotus Cobra, landfall, add 1 mana of any color to your mana pool. Magus of the Vineyard, it is a single green. At the beginning of each player's pre-combat main phase, add double green to that player's mana pool. Again, kind of like the Eldorami's Vineyard. Not sure kind of what the point is here either.
Yeah, I'm with you there a little bit for sure.
Peripheral Scout of the Forge. Creatures come in, everybody goes boom. That's pretty much what that card does.
Yep.
Sereth the Viper's Fang, 2 green for a human warlock. Other tapped creatures you control have Death Touched. Untapped creatures you control have Hexproof. And then you can pay 1 and tap it to untap another target creature or land you control. Shaman of the Forgotten Ways, 2 and a green. You can tap it to add 2 mana in any combination of colors to your mana pool, but you can only spend it on creature spells. And it also has Formidable for 9 green, and tap. Each player's life total becomes the number of creatures he or she controls. Activate this ability only if a creature you control has total power 8 or greater, which, with the shared animosity, is going to always happen, probably. Shizuku, Caller of Autumn, 1 green. At the beginning of each player's upkeep, that player adds triple green to his or her mana pool. That mana doesn't cause mana burn. Until end of turn, that mana doesn't leave the mana pool as phases change. Spark Double, 3 and a blue. It can enter as a copy of any creature on the battlefield, or planeswalker you control, except if it's a planeswalker, it gets an additional loyalty counter, and if it's a creature and it was legendary, it loses the legendary and comes in with a +1/+1 counter. Surok Dragonclaw, 2 and Teamer, Flash, it can't be countered. Creature spells you control can't be countered, and other creatures you control have Trample. There's the Trample enabler.
There's all the things you needed right there.
Yep. Tidal Barracuda, 3 and a blue. Any player may cast spells as though they had Flash, but opponents can't cast spells during your turn. And then last but not least, Tireless Provisioner, 2 and a green. It has landfall. When a land enters the battlefield under your control, create a food or a treasure token. So, audience, there are a few more things than just 1 for landfall, but again, not a lot. What do you think, Dana? I mean, we know what you think. They should all be snakes.
They should all be snakes.
This is just the Rick and Morty episode in my head now. The snake episode.
Yeah, and like there's just a lot of good stuff here. Don't get me wrong. There's a few things I would pull if I was trying to, change things up. Like if you wanted to go power, since you're making all your opponents draw cards, a Consecrated Sphinx is crazy in here. Like there's plenty of those kind of changes one could make. I just do think that you're putting a nice little speed bump in your way if you do switch to snakes and you do focus more on the combat damage wins. There's just only so far you can crank that lever in the power direction then, and if you want to keep it in check, that's a way I would look at doing it. So as for individual cards, the couple that you didn't love, I didn't necessarily love either, Max, or at least didn't quite understand what the role there was, other than just, I'm assuming he had them.
Yeah.
So I get that. I guess it happens sometimes. But yeah, that's where I would make the wholesale changes. I still think I would just swap those out and pop in a bunch of snakes.
Yeah, I love the snake idea. I definitely think this is a lot of good stuff in this creature block.
Yes.
My biggest thing is I think it just needs some definition. I think there's
Sure.
between the artifacts and the creatures, there's a handful of landfall-esque cards, but they don't really do anything. Like, cool, Ancient Green Warden is out, and you have a Lotus Cobra out, so you're getting 2 mana for the Lotus Cobra every time you play a land, and then you play something from your graveyard.
Mm-hmm.
Also, the fact that, like, your meta has that uncolored fetch rule, you aren't running a lot of fetches, so you can't really abuse that, and again, you're only running 36 lands, so you're going to fail to find eventually when you start reusing your fetches from your graveyard.
Yes, for sure.
Which is, I guess, fine, but if you really want to make 2 treasure tokens or 2 food tokens, which if Essex is out will turn into snakes, and I feel like this is combo, but really, really hard to get to combo for this type of deck.
Yeah, I would agree.
You could easily just, like, the one card I had in here was Druid of Purification. It's 3 and a green. When it enters the battlefield, starting with you, each player may choose an artifact or enchantment you don't control, and destroy each permanent chosen this way. It fits into the group hug aspect because everybody gets a choice, but your stuff doesn't get hit. So your Primal Vigor will stick around, or your Dictate of Krufix will stick around, or your Altar of Dementia will stick around, but you can get rid of that. You can politic a little and be like, well, that Doubling Season across the table needs to go away, or that All Hallmarks Archive needs to go away. I just think that'd be probably a little more fun in the group hug aspect, because you're involving the whole table.
Yeah, that makes sense.
And, I mean, there's just a bunch of creatures that have tap abilities that draw cards. If that's really what you want to be doing here is making your opponents draw cards or you draw cards to make snakes, run those cards. Yeah, they're 6 mana and probably have triple colored pips, but I don't think that's a problem with this deck since you're already running a lot of stuff that is double pipped or multicolored pipped.
That kind of thing is also, we talk about a little bit under the land base, does make things a little bit tricky sometimes for sure.
Yeah.
And I particularly in my 3-color decks try to minimize that, so it's not bad here necessarily, but there's a few things that throw it off.
Yeah.
Any final thoughts on this deck, Max?
I like this. I like that it isn't the typical wheel Xyris deck that you see 95% of the time.
Right.
I do think it just needs a little bit of a, what do you really want to do here? Like, I understand putting the cool landfall cards in here, but if you do that, in my mind, you want more lands, because you want to trigger those abilities more often than not, and the fact that there are only a handful of landfall-type cards in this deck means you're not going to see them a lot. And there are no tutors, so you can't go get them. So maybe you just need to try cutting those type of cards and try something new. You know, that would be my suggestion. I feel like, 90% of this deck wants to do the tokens things, 7% of this deck wants to do the +1/+1 counter things.
Right.
And then the other 3% wants to do landfall stuff. And at that point, cut that 3% and maybe bump up the +1/+1 counter stuff, or do more token stuff, or just maybe make one of those strategies a little stronger. That would be my opinion. Otherwise, I really like this deck, and I'd be interested to play against it if we ever could over like virtual EDHR, hopefully when events come back later this year or next year.
Yeah.
But yeah, that's just kind of my thought. I think there's just a little too much going on.
I agree. Needs a little bit of focusing down. But yes, I'm on the same page, Max. I like seeing Xyris deck that isn't just built around wheeling everyone to oblivion. Much more interesting. So, Armadale, thank you very much for sharing that with us. We appreciate it. That is going to wrap up episode 313 of Commander Central. We'll be back next week with a new show. You can find me on the Twitterbirds at Dana Roach. You can find Max at CMDRCentral_Max. And you can find Chris at WiseSquishy1. Our show is edited by Rafael Garcia, and you can find them on Twitter at Ursa Bearwalker. And our podcast theme is Retro Future Dirty by Kevin MacLeod, licensed via Creative Commons. We will be back next week with a new show. Until then, I am Dana.
And I'm Max.